So when we first spoke to President Clinton and his team about attending One Young World, not only did he say he would attend, but he also said that he didn't want to make a speech. What he would rather do is interact with some of the brilliant young delegates that we have here. So we actually have 6 delegates from around the world who are going to ask a question, and President Clinton is going to reply to those questions. So we've chosen 6 delegates from around the world. If they could make their way to the steps so that they're ready to actually ask their questions. And first up, we have Hassan from Iraq.
Hello, sir. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. I have one question. My question is, do you think the Iraqi people or the people from the Middle East are ready for the Arab Spring?
So the question was, do you think the people from the Middle East and Iraq are ready for the Arab Spring?
The accurate answer about what I think is yes and no. And I'd like to explain. I think anytime people can be freer to chart their own course, that's a good thing. They're ready. I think in the whole march of liberty, however, is an uneven process. And it unfolds differently in different countries. For example, if you've lived in an organized society that was authoritarian for a long time, it might have some quite good features. If you take Iraq, for example, there was always the risk after Saddam fell that there would be a Sunni-Shia split that we've seen manifest in various ways, and that the role of women and girls might be compromised because it takes a long time to build a democracy. You may think democracy is majority rule, but if that's all you have and you have any kind of sectarian or other divides in the society, it can become mob rule. It's majority rule, minority rights, individual rights, the rule of law, and some sort of consensual decision-making process. So what you have seen in the last few years is the struggle to hold together one country that includes a very large Kurdish minority, to reconcile the competing claims of various groups to oil, and how the resources should be divided between the national and local governments, and then largely, how are they going to relate to us? How are they going to relate to Iran? All these mega questions. But underneath, the fact that the people of Iraq have more control over their destiny if they can keep from consuming themselves in the fires of violence is a good thing. Tunisia, I think, is off to a pretty good start. Libya, you know, it's a lot of political controversy in America now because of the horrible terrorist killing of the Americans in Benghazi, but that American ambassador was the most popular foreigner in Libya. And Libyan citizens risked their lives to storm 2 armed militia offices, unarmed, to disarm them, to demonstrate that they wanted a peaceful future. So I think once you took down Gaddafi's security apparatus, created a lot of vacuums for others to move into, and those people will try to wreck Libya's experiment in the Arab Spring and democracy. But if you have enough people brave enough to march on armed compounds, I would say there's a pretty good prospect for success there. Egypt, I think Morsi's off to a pretty good start. He's trying to reconcile the need to keep his Islamic political party base intact, not be upset by the Salafis, and deliver something to the more secular Egyptians who actually, the young people who started the Arab Spring, in part because Egypt offers an extreme example of what is a global problem, including in the United States. The university system was not dismantled under Mubarak. It continued to produce 400,000 university graduates a year. but the economy produced nowhere near 400,000 jobs for university graduates a year. So you have an economic dimension of this, a social dimension, a political dimension, and a security dimension. And the only thing I would say is the roadmap will be uneven and bumpy in all of these places, but the road to democracy always is. Keep in mind, when the United States was founded more than 200 years ago, only white male property owners could vote. White male property owners. African Americans were designated in our Constitution as 2/3 of a person when counting for the census. We had a civil war, which was still, in terms of the percentage of our people killed, the bloodiest of all of our conflicts, determining whether we could still be one country if the slaves became free. And then it took another 100 years after that to remove the last legal vestiges of slavery. And even since then, there's been an ongoing effort to get the practical consequences of our whole history worked out. Meanwhile, women have risen to more legal equality, but we still don't have anywhere near as many women in our Congress as the Rwandans have in Parliament. And we still have a pay disparity, and we're having a presidential election where one candidate, President Obama, signed something called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, simply guarantees equal pay for equal work and the right to sue to get it if you don't have it. And the other candidate, Governor Romney, wouldn't even say in the debate the other night whether he would have signed the bill. He didn't want to say I wouldn't because then he'd make the women voters mad. He didn't want to say I would because then he'd make his right-wing base mad. So this is a long, Max Weber, I recommend you, if you really care about this, I recommend you read a short book or a long essay written at the end of World War I in 1918 by a German sociologist who was a Christian Democrat in those terms called Max Weber. It's called Politics is a Vocation. And the defining sentence in the whole thing is that politics is the long and slow boring of hard boards. So if you want the Arab Spring to work, you have to build it. So I'd say, yes, the people are ready, but they don't have the institutional supports or the experience to make it work yet. You have to build it. And building it will be a different task, a different challenge in different countries. And in some of those countries, you risk getting killed if you try.
Thank you. The next question comes from Mahodo from Benin.
Good evening. So my question is about international aid. What do you recommend as immediate and long-term measure to curb the over-reliance of third world countries on donor nations in sectors like education, health, and food security? And what can young people do?
So what do you recommend in terms of reducing the reliance that third world countries have on international aid in sectors like health, education, etc.?
First, I do a lot of work in this area, and with my foundation, and my goal is always to work myself out of a job. So the first thing I would say is, first, I will give you two examples, one highly relevant by history to your country. But I would say first, the country involved, receiving the aid, has to make a decision that its goal is to deal with other countries on an equal basis, seeking investment or trade or whatever, without aid. And then to seek that goal in a sensible way, being honest enough to say, if our incomes are too low, if our health indicators are too bad, if we don't have our people in school yet, we may need aid for a certain time. So I'll give you two examples. First, Rwanda. After the Rwandan genocide, 4 years after the genocide, their per capita income was still about $268 a year. They defined a set of goals to become a self-sufficient country, one of which was the complete equal treatment and involvement of women, which is a practical matter they had to do, since when 10% of the country was slaughtered in 90 days in the genocide, 80% of that 10% were men, maybe 85%. So now they have 56% of the parliament female, half the governors female, half the mayors female. They also had a very disciplined plan to grow the economy, and in 12 years their per capita income went from $268 to about $1,100. Last year the government gave every rural farm family a cow, a dairy cow. Sounds simple. 600,000 people in 1 year moved above the global poverty line with a cow. And with every village getting a shed in which the cows could be cared for and milked on a regular basis. And people being trained to do that who didn't know how. Okay, here's what I know. I worked mostly in Rwanda on agriculture and healthcare. We started by bringing them the world's least expensive AIDS medicine. Then we began to give them the testing equipment. Then we started working on other diseases and maternal and child health, and eventually we got to building health systems. Rwanda has an excellent health minister. They're getting all this aid, including from the United States. But most Western countries, not all, Norway is an exception, most Western countries require a lot of their money to go through home country NGOs, who typically will take an administrative fee in the home country and then another one in the country where the aid is received, and do things that they have decided are good for the country. I think that's patronizing. I don't go anywhere where the government doesn't ask, and I make them decide what we're going to do. If they want my opinion or the opinion of our people who do this work, we give it, but they decide. And then if we can help them, we say this is what we'll do, and we make a deal. But I think it's very important, first, to continue to build the capacity of the government to govern in any area with a goal to be independent. What's the point of all this? There was this plan in America to have a family health initiative over 5 years in Rwanda at a cost of $50 million through American NGOs, and the Rwandans didn't really want the money. They didn't want to do that. What they came to us and said is, we have a plan now that, let me back up, Paul Farmer in Partners in Health and our foundation, we built a hospital in every region of Rwanda where they had been destroyed during the genocide. Then they said in 2 regions, we would like to ask you to try the Partners in Health model from Haiti, that is regional clinics, and then train community health workers going to every community in the country. So at least people would stop dying anonymously and we could do basic care. After we did 2, they said, okay, stop. It was unbelievable, it's wonderful. They said, stop. Now we had to figure out how we can have a national system sort of like this that we can afford to run when we don't take aid anymore. Because their goal is to be totally free of foreign aid by 2020. Help us design a training program to completely revamp our healthcare workforce from the doctors on down to do that. We said, okay. And keep in mind, is Rwanda, one of these hospitals near Uganda, Butaro, is the best cancer treatment center in all of Central Africa. They wanted good hospitals, but then a network that a poor country could afford to run. We got 13 American medical schools, 13, to agree to retrain the entire workforce over 2 years for a total overhead of 7%. They're going to lose money doing this. They used to take 15 or 20% at home, 15 or 20% there. And they were appalled that this was going on. So they said, we'll do it for 7%. And we just had a huge announcement on it. And it shook the aid world because no one had ever done it before like that. And my foundation, we don't take any money. I raise the money from private donors to help do this, so we don't take any government money. And they did this, and the USAID, to their credit, and I might add the Secretary of State, for the first time, took this other project down and gave the money to what the Rwandans wanted, direct to the Rwandan government, trusting them with the money to work with us to do that. So if you want to do something, you have to design for it. You have to decide you want to be free of foreign assistance and then say, how can we do this as soon as possible and still take care of our people? Example one. Okay? Example two, more related to your history. Until the 70s, Benin was known as Dahomey. And it was the home of the Fon people who created, is that your background? They created the religion we in the West know as voodoo. And they are the people who primarily settled Haiti. So before the earthquake in Haiti, they had a per capita income of about $770 a year. Poorest country in our hemisphere. After the earthquake, they were wrecked. They wanted to build a banking system. And the banks were not interested because Haitians get about 20% of their income every year from remittances. That is, the Haitians in America or in Canada or France or in the Bahamas, the four biggest sources, and elsewhere in the Caribbean, and they send it home. So these big banks that have kind of a monopoly on the business, they make all the money they need by, I send my money to you, and they convert it from dollars to Haitian gourds and take a fee. So they were literally charging like 45 to 60% interest for small business loans and not providing consumer banking services like we thought they should. So the largest cell phone company in Haiti is a company, an Irish company, Digicel, run by a man named Dennis O'Brien. And they agreed to provide banking services by cell phone because it was sustainable because 80% of the Haitians had a cell phone, even though only 10% used the banks. Right? So now, if you're a poor Haitian, but you have any source of income and you want to do something with your cash and you want to access banking services, you use your cell phone. That's a sustainable system. And I could give you, I got a couple of donors to give me $20 million, and we set up a small business loan system. And the donors said, we don't want our money back, but we want people to pay back the loans. And we started making small business loans at rates from 6.5% to 8%. We have 100% payback. The fund is growing all the time now because people are paying it back, and we are going to turn it over, and there'll be a small business loan facility. And a fund for the second President Bush and I raised, we helped to set up a mortgage system. They never had a mortgage system. If you go to Haiti, it looks like there are all these abandoned houses. They're not abandoned houses. They're houses being built brick by brick, sometimes over 15 or 20 years, because there's no mortgage system. So we're setting up a mortgage system. We're going to turn that over to them, but it will be one that they can run on terms they can afford, all designed to increase capacity and get rid of aid. So you have to design for this, and you have to have a realistic timetable, and the people and the government have to want it. The Rwandans want it badly. They want to be free of foreign aid by 2020. So, and then the NGOs and the governments that are giving the aid need to behave. They need to act like their goal is to work themselves out of a job. We want people to stand on their own 2 feet, chart their own future. We want to be there to help and then go.
That's a great point. The next question is from Mahita from India. Over there on the left.
Hello, Mr. Clinton. My question is, what are the greatest challenges that the United States and the world seas in the coming decade? And what does this country do to tackle them?
So what are the greatest challenges the world and the US faces in the next decade, and what needs to be done to tackle them?
What are they?
Yes, what are the greatest challenges, and what do you think needs to be done to tackle them?
Well, basically, the world faces 3 great challenges. Maybe 300, but they all fall into basically, they fall into 3 big baskets. The modern world generates a lot of wealth, a lot of ideas, a lot of entrepreneurialism. It's full of people like you who come to conferences like this. This is stimulating and exciting and wonderful. The problem is, huge numbers of people from every country here represented are left out of this process. And therefore, there's too much inequality. And every time in a very poor country, let's say a village woman has an idea and a skill and wants to work and can't get credit, has no access to the Grameen Bank or whatever, it's a constraint on growth and it aggravates inequality. It is devastating. We finally have people in the United States recognizing that the growing inequality in our country is a constraint on our growth and our prosperity. So the inequality of access to education, to health care, to competent government, to political liberties, all of this inequality, including to credit and the ability to start businesses, every country and the globe has to have a strategy for dealing with that. The Millennium Development Goals do it, but they're written as if we're all doing good. We're not doing good. We're saving ourselves and our future and our children and our grandchildren. It is a common interest we have to empower people and reduce inequalities. Second big problem the world has is it's too unstable. Now, most of you will do fine in this world. Most of you can get into the market economies of wherever you're from, and you'll do great. And all market economies depend on some risk, some chance of failure to have a reward of success. And if you're good at picking winners, like my friend Eunice here has been with the Grameen Bank, you get a 98% or 99% payback, and the bank makes money and you create opportunity, but there's got to be some play in the system here. But if there is too much instability, everything just shuts down. It's what happened in the financial crisis. It starts in America, all of a sudden consumes Europe and it's hurting people everywhere. It's what terrorists hope will happen when they kill far fewer people than died in single battles in World War I. But what they want to do is scare the living daylights out of everybody so no one will invest time or money or spirit in some more productive enterprise to organize people in a positive way. And so I think all these instabilities in the world need to be studied with a view toward creating enough play and freedom for dynamism and growth and empowerment to occur, but enough limits to avoid a total shutdown. I mean, basically, if you look at this financial crisis, it's pretty simple. It's like all the others. You just had too much risk being taken with too little capital to back up the level of risk that is being taken. And, you know, in my generation of Americans, we're mostly raised by our mothers to believe that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And anytime you forget that, you start getting in trouble. But there are examples of that all over the world. Too much instability. Third big problem is the growth model on which the West and Japan grew rich, and on which China and to a certain extent the other rising countries are attempting to grow rich, which is that you can't get rich, stay rich, and get richer unless you consume more and more resources and put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's simply not sustainable, because the climate is changing at an alarming rate with damaging consequences which threaten to shut the whole thing down and compromise your future and certainly the future of your children. So what we have to do is to find practical ways to work our way out of that without minimizing the enormous challenges that are presented. For example, before I came here, I did a rally for President Obama, a political rally, down in Ohio, just next door, in a region where a lot of people think they can't vote for him because they make a living out of the coal industry. And his government has said, properly I think, that coal is a hazardous greenhouse gas. It's not good for our health. Something has to be done about it. But nobody has offered a practical response like the Germans and the Danes have. Denmark generates 25% of its electricity from wind. Germany, on a sunny day last spring, generated so much power from the sun that it was equivalent of 20 nuclear power plants. And yet both of them still have coal-fired plants running because they can't shut them down. So what they did was to say, you have to mix the coal with 20% wood pellets that have from sustainable forests or wood waste. So we are going to take these things down gradually so we don't have to throw everybody out of work. The most important climate change study that came out last year, from my perspective, because I spend an enormous amount of time trying to help cities all over the world and countries deal with climate change in a way that's good economics. Most important study was one which said we could slow the rate of global warming for 20 years by half, and in the Arctic Circle, where it's worst, by 2/3 if we went after aggressively the most rapidly dispersing greenhouse gases. CO2 from coal will stay in the atmosphere 50 to 100 years. All other greenhouse gases, including methane, which is 25 times more intense than CO2, disperse more quickly. Most methane is from agriculture and urban garbage dumps. So we should close every dump in every big city in the world, recycle the plastic, metal, and glass, and use the rest to generate power in some form or another that recovers the land, ends a public health problem, and avoids the methane going into the atmosphere. Black carbon, mostly charcoal from cooking. We should move people off cooking. We're doing a lot of cooking in Haitian schools now, for example, with little briquettes made from urban waste. It's cheaper, doesn't emit greenhouse gas emissions, avoids a public health problem. Lots of movement on that. We got to do more of that. And the rest are from hydrofluorocarbons and chlorofluorocarbons, mostly coming out of room air conditioners in India and China. And there are ways to get rid of those without taking the air conditioner away from the hot people. In other words, there are solutions to this, and if you look at how we dealt with other similar problems, we can do it. But the larger point I want to make is this is a more distant problem than whether your village would be racked by sectarian violence. But if we don't do something about this, this could take your future away. And yet, changing the way we produce and consume energy and lose local resources could be the biggest economic boom the world has seen in poor and rich countries like in those in the middle. Take India, for example, which has the largest number of really poor people in the world and the world's largest middle class, and nobody's ever figured out how to connect the prosperity centers to the rural areas, or alternatively, how to develop an economically sustainable model. And a lot of people say they like microcredit, but one of the things that Eunice ought to talk about here, he and his colleagues in microcredit in Bangladesh, in years when they almost had no national government because of the quarreling factions there, still sustained 6% growth a year because they had enough grassroots development to swim against the political tides. It's almost the only place in the world where this happened. We have to worry about this. China is building 2 of these giant gravity-driven canals connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, because the Yellow River is drying up in parts of the year. It never occurred to them that you may not be able to have 27 million people in the Beijing area. We may have to relocate people. We might be doing something in China. A lot of Chinese engineers, not environmental activists, engineers, are saying they may dry up both rivers at various times of the year. It would be calamitous. Then what are they going to do? Go take more of the headwaters of the Mekong and infuriate everybody in Southeast Asia? I mean, these are very serious problems, but I can tell you, based on my experience, if you deal with them, they're enormous economic opportunities. And I'll just give you, if I might, 2 examples. Mexico City has grown so much they've outgrown Brazil in the last 2 years, partly because they have an eco-economy now that has given Mexico City cleaner air than Los Angeles on a clean day. Costa Rica is the richest country in Central America by light years, largely because it has no army and it has a green ethic. 92% of its electricity comes from hydropower. The rest can easily come from geothermal they're developing. The president of Costa Rica, who runs a center-right government, said to me, "They tell me we have oil under the ground and offshore, but we have no intention of finding out." So I said, why? She said, because, she said, that's not our brand. We want to be a sustainable economy. We don't want to know. I said, what can I do to help? She said, we're importing $1 billion worth of oil a year. I want you to get me a green car company down here. Get me an electric car manufacturer in Costa Rica, and I will buy every last car they can produce until every Costa Rican is in one. We have a school and a clinic in every town. We will put rechargers everywhere. And when every Costa Rican is in one, we can export duty-free to Mexico and the U.S. Now, that's the kind of design thinking. The Brazilians are trying to come to grips with this. They're the greenest big country in the world, but they want more hydropower, and now the only place they can get it's in the rainforest. They need to go to more solar power. They want to be, again, for the 5th year in a row, and next year the 6th year, the only country in the world that has more than half its fuels from the world's finest biofuel. Cane ethanol from Brazil gives you 9.3 gallons of fuel for every 1 gallon of oil. And they don't take down the rainforest. You need very deep topsoil to grow sugarcane. But they do push the soybean farmers and the cattle ranchers into the rainforest. They need a solution to that. Part of it is there are 180 million acres in Brazil that are arable and not yet being farmed. They need a Homestead Act like the United States had 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago now, to let people, give them the incentive to move away from the rainforest if they want to save the rainforest. But anyway, these are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about. The world is not sustainable, it's too unstable, and it's too unequal. All the big challenges you will face will be in one of those 3 categories. Poor countries have to build systems to deal with it. Wealthy countries, Japan, Europe, Canada, the United States, we got to reform the systems we have to deal with it. The countries that do so will do well. The countries that don't will be punished.
And we have time for one final question. So one final question from Becky from the USA. Becky. She's over there again.
Thanks so much for taking my question. The UN Development Program is now looking at a framework for the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals. And one of the challenges they've identified since 2000 is a deeper understanding of the critical role that the private sector plays in achieving these goals. So how do you see the private sector contributing to these post-2015 MDG framework?
Well, I think, did they hear that? Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
What should the role of the private sector be in contributing to the next round of Millennium Development Goals and achieving these larger social purposes? I think the answer is different in different places, but first of all, in every really thriving economy in the world, more people are either working for themselves or somebody else than for the government. You want a strong government. You want a government with capacity to deal with what a government can best do. But first thing you have to say is, if you live in a poor country, is how can the private sector contribute to employment without burdening the society with environmental problems, destruction of local resources, or climate change. In Costa Rica did something that I would like Kenya to look at, for example. They had 41% of their land in forest cover a decade ago. They're now 51% because the urban dwellers by the water voluntarily supported a government program to increase their water rates, to send the money to upland farmers so they could make more money by planting trees than by tearing them down. So you need the private sector to be vibrant, but it needs to work in a way that's not counterproductive. Then I think there ought to be incentives and just opportunities for people by design to design social advances as part of the business model. I'll give you an example. Does anybody know, any American here know who the two biggest users of solar panels in the United States are? Walmart and Costco. And they are advancing a social cause. They think it's good business. Walmart's also changing all their freezers for food to use LED lighting. But the government can make a big difference. For example, Los Angeles, we work with them. They decided to replace all 140,000 of their street lights with LED street lights. Huge advance in greenhouse gas emissions. And we created opportunities for the private sector to supply that. But I think that first, in poor countries, people need a job and an income. So they either have to work for themselves or somebody else, unless they're among the fortunate few that can work for the government. Second, if you have an ongoing business, they should be working in every country in a way that is consistent with helping the country to meet its challenges, whether they're climate challenges, local water challenges, or whatever else. And thirdly, I think that there should be greater cooperation between governments and NGOs to figure out how to deal with all these things in a way that speeds up the implementation of the goal. You know, this year at the Clinton Global Initiative, we called our meeting Designing for Impact. We decided we needed to help people more think about the end when they begin and design accordingly. And I think the private sector can really contribute to that all over the world. And then, finally, I would like to say just one thing about people who make money out of natural resources. I think they have a special responsibility to help countries, particularly that are fragile, avoid the so-called resource trap. There are any number of countries that are actually poorer and worse, have worse governments because they have oil or because they have diamonds or because they have something rare earths or minerals. And I think that whatever goals are decided upon, we need to think of the things that have to be done by the private sector in order to have any reasonable chance of uniform progress. I mean, there's a reason Botswana is the richest country in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is they took their diamond money and they put it in a public trust and they put it all on the internet and they tell everybody what money's coming in from where and when it goes out, where it's going, and it's all there in a transparent way, and you can see they have used their resource money to diversify their economy and to build the integrity and capacity of their government. So I think you should think about that, for example, not just for the natural resource industry, but agriculture. There's a big debate going on in the world today. Should we increase the productivity of smallholder farms, which is I do a lot of work on, which can easily be doubled in almost any developing country in the world and often can be tripled or quadrupled with basic things that don't cost much money? Or are we going to have mechanized farming in Africa and elsewhere where there's good soil still undeveloped? Well, I think the Millennium Development Goals ought to have a whole different pact on that about what we should do to find the answers to that, and what are the socially and environmentally responsible ways to explore that question. Because in most African countries, for example, and in many countries in South and Southeast Asia, or parts of the rural areas of South Asia and many Southeast Asian countries, and a lot of rural Latin America, keeping people on their own land is a big part of the framework of society. So we ought to know we can't do that and produce enough food to keep the world alive before we abandon that course. And we have not seriously made an effort to substantially increase the productivity of smallholder farms and their ability to conserve resources. So before we write that off as a big part of the solution, we should make a serious effort to find out. And it really bothers me that people say, well, of course that can't be done. You know, we worked with a bunch of farmers in Malawi. One woman had a 1/4 acre of land. One year she made $80. The next year, just by increasing the feed, seed, fertilizer, and making sure she didn't have to give up half of her income to transport the food to market, her income went from $80 to $400. If you could, now I don't think we can quintuple everybody's income, but the worst we do is double, and the average more than triple in the places where I work. It is nuts to give this up before we have a systematic effort in the countries that want to keep the fabric of rural life as it is to see how well we can do. So there needs to be thought not just on what these goals are, but we know enough now from the effort to reach the current Millennium Development Goals how to do it and where we don't have the systems in place to do it, and what specific big obstacles or opportunities are out there. So the goals ought to be like this, but there ought to be an addendum about what we're actually going to do to turn our good intentions into real changes.
Well, President Clinton, we want to thank you. We understand how busy you are given other things that are going on in America at the moment. Thank you so much for your time. And let's give President Clinton a huge warm young well. Thank you.